There will be a lot more need for coordinated policy efforts within government. If you talk about energy, for example, there are other alternative sources of energy that these operators can use. For example, if you focus on a region like the northern part of Kenya or the northeastern part of Kenya, there's a lot of sunshine. And I remember yesterday when the permanent secretary was opening this event, he did mention that it is important for us as a country to harness that, abundant energy, which is solar energy, to supplement or complement the other alternatives, that is hydroelectric power, which is essentially one, very scarce, and two, very expensive.
Right.
And therefore, the ministries or authorities in charge of energy, in charge of other physical infrastructure such as roads, would have to put their heads together to have a more coordinated, planning framework that would then respond to the needs of either investors who are willingly able to go to those areas or those who would be able to source for this fund. Because I agree with you that those other facilities are important. And again, when you talk about the counties wanting to pounce, if I may use that word,
yes,
on these operators, there has been a lot of effort recently between the Ministry of Information and Communication and the Ministry of Local Government to try to find a way through which operators that have been licensed to provide infrastructure and deliver services either get waivers if possible, or perhaps through the budget declare that such operators should not be subjected to multiple taxes. And we hope those efforts will bear fruit. We will not stop. We will continue talking to the other significant authorities in government to ensure that the efforts towards attaining Vision 2030 are not compromised by the need or the
hindrances mentioned again in that study is high operation and maintenance costs, poor access to roads, provision of security for infrastructure, and for instance also some now with counties, every county might want to make some money off an operator laying cable there. So you're coming through Nairobi County wants to make some money, then Kiambu, and then as you go along, so obviously overall the costs are much higher.
Okay, suddenly there would, out of an area which was formerly not well served, essentially that is an indicator that this area can, attract more investment and therefore, deliver more benefits to the same private sector that would have essentially in the beginning not been willing to go to those areas.
But one of an
alternative means for them to source for resources to complement their own private efforts, because what we will do is that for any project that requires delivery of essential services to areas that have been identified, we would go through a tendering process. We would come up with specific projects that are designed to respond appropriately to the needs of those areas that we have identified. Then upon tendering, all the entities that are in the market would bid. Now, the one that would have the best or the most appropriate solution technologically, and two, the one that would require the least subsidy, among other factors, would then get part of this money to supplement the private efforts that they would have. So in the long run, what we are doing is to create upfront demand for them, because when a community of users emerges, yes, to a certain extent, but you see, when you mobilize funds through alternative means, and I must add that this has been done in many other parts of the world. Countries in Latin America have driven their data infrastructure development through mobilization of these funds. Countries like India, Pakistan also have these funds. Malaysia, countries like South Africa, just across the borders, Uganda and Tanzania have similar funds. Now, much as the private sector might not find it palatable, if I may use that word, to contribute to this fund, what this fund does is actually to provide.
This has an element of the price wars going on right now, because operators will want to put in the money and the investment where they make the most money. Yes. And putting an internet connection or a data signal in Nokichoge may not make that much economic sense, like in the central business district here in Nairobi.
Essentially.
Yes.
And possibly through other channels such as government appropriation and perhaps even utilization of the devolved funds partly. Now, a combination of all these resources put together will drive the intentions that we think are necessary coming out of what we have identified through this study.
Because
one very important policy reorientation, and our intention is to engage government, because nothing can move without the involvement of government, is to come up with a more comprehensive policy framework that captures all the initiatives on broadband that are actually going on today and those that will happen in the future. So one of the things that will happen would be the drafting, possibly, of a broadband policy that integrates all these efforts that we're talking about. Now, part of the solution, I must admit, will be the mobilization of funds through what you have already had, perhaps the Universal Service Fund,
yes,
to leverage these investments to complement the efforts of the private sector. Partly because the private sector is only able to cover that market-related gap that they would find essentially relevant to their investment needs. But there is that other part of the access gaps, which we call the true access gaps, which the private sector, looking at their investment models, looking at their long-term profitability intentions, will not be able to go to such areas, and therefore a combination of factors, including mobilization of funds through the Universal Service
frameworks that this study is going to inform in terms of how the government and the CCK needs to craft your policy going forward to make sure that we sort of bridge this gap.
Yes. One important,
really,
even more important in terms of delivering vital information first to the community at large. If you talk of provision of essential government services, for example, civil registration, security-related information, delivery of educational information, delivery of medical-related information, that is extremely important. And when you focus on activities such as agriculture and other micro-enterprise activities, data is the only essential element that can drive growth in all these human endeavors, right from the lowest level to the highest level. So connecting the village, as we refer to them, to the urban area, and indeed to the international destinations, will be the beginning of the growth of this economy towards the intended heights.
Is there any policy
on both sides of the equation, that is voice and data?
I want to stay on this for a little longer, because according to that study, about over 25 million Kenyans have access to a mobile phone, but only about 4.7 million have access to data.
Yes.
But we already know about studies that have been done about the importance of a mobile phone in the hands of somebody in a rural area, in terms of direct GDP growth. But is data equally important?
It is even more. Was reviewed in 2006. Now, new targets for data connectivity were included, so that now the focus would be to use data to drive the economy and public services more than voice. And this is not out of the ordinary, because most countries have followed a similar path. What I can say is that perhaps the initial focus of even the operators that we licensed was mainly on the provision of data services.
Yes.
But we've seen in the recent past, most companies that have been licensed in Kenya are refocusing their business strategy towards data. Most of them have already acquired the 3G spectrum that is essentially important in facilitating the provision of data. So perhaps in the next 5 to 10 years, now with the gap that we have identified and the necessary investment that is required to drive strategies towards acquisition of more data infrastructure, together with private sector initiatives, we are looking forward to a more balanced growth. When the telecommunications and postal sector statement was released, and if you just have a glance at the objectives then. The idea was actually to increase connectivity both in urban and rural areas in terms of penetration. And when the policy frame, the initial government policy on telecommunications basically focused on voice. If you go back to 1997...
Voice, it seems to have made a lot more strides than data. Why is that?
It is that because, well, the idea of having fiber connectivity,
yes,
especially the landing of the submarine cables,
right,
was actually to ensure that Kenya, and indeed the Eastern African region, is connected through more affordable means to international destinations. If you remember, in the past, we used to rely heavily on satellite. Satellite, quite reliable though, but fairly more expensive. What really did happen is that we have not invested adequately in national broadband infrastructure. We're supposed now to be connected to those cables to ensure connectivity from Kenya to other parts of the world. So there's a lot more that we need to do in terms of investment, in terms of policy reorientation to realize those objectives both at government level and at private sector level.
All right.
Yes.
In terms of an interesting one, 27 million people who don't have access when we have almost 4 fiber cables terminating here, and we were told this would be the magic bullet. Once fiber got here, we're sorted.
Yes.
What happened? And almost dumbing down what this report says for us. What are some of the things that stand out for you first?
First and foremost, the most striking element out of this report is the revelation that almost 27 million Kenyans do not have access to data services.
Right.
The other equally important element is that internet connectivity still lags behind the intentions that government has put for itself in Vision 2030. Having made ICT as the main driver of attaining that vision, it is quite depressing, if I may, to find that data, which is the most important element of that intention, is still lagging behind many other countries that you can imagine of, like South Africa and Egypt,
right,
which are the countries that we can be compared with as a developing country.
And that data figure